Her sister's veil was still lying on the chapel floor when Margaret Ashford understood that her family was ruined. It lay where Isabel had flung it, a drift of white lace on the gray stones between the box pews and the altar rail, and the whole church was so silent that Margaret could hear the candles burning. At the rail, alone, stood the man her sister had just refused. Adrian, Duke of Ravenhall, whom the county called the Beast, and he had not moved at all. He stood with his scarred cheek turned a little from the light, his gloved left hand at his side, and he looked at the veil on the floor the way a man looks at weather he has seen before. It had taken Isabel Ashford 11 words to ruin them. She had come up the aisle on their father's arm, the most beautiful bride the shire had produced in a generation, and the county had packed the pews to watch the sacrifice, for everyone knew what the marriage was. Everyone knew Sir Charles Ashford of Renfold owed more than Renfold was worth. Everyone knew the Duke of Ravenhall had offered to clear the whole of it, quietly, through his solicitor, in the marriage articles, and everyone knew that no woman in England had looked twice at the Duke since he came back from the war with his face laid open and his left hand ruined, whatever his rank and his 40,000 a year. They had come to see beauty sold to the beast. And at the rail, when the parson began, Isabel had turned and looked up into the Duke's face. Really looked, for perhaps the first time in the whole cold transaction, and Margaret, from the second pew, had seen her sister's famous composure crack like ice on a puddle. "I cannot," Isabel said. "Before God, I cannot. Not that face. I am sorry, I cannot." Then she threw back her veil, tore the pins from it, flung it down on the stones, and ran down the whole length of the aisle. Her satin slippers loud in the silence, past 3 parishes worth of open mouths, out through the great door and into the June morning. The door boomed. Somewhere in the gallery a woman tittered and stopped. Sir Charles Ashford stood at the rail with his mouth working and nothing coming out of it. Lady Ashford had gone the color of the veil and swayed against her pew. The parson, old Mr. Price, held his book as though it might catch fire. And the Duke of Ravenhall stood quite still, looking down at the veil on the stones, while behind him the county began, very softly to whisper, and Margaret Ashford, 23 years old, plain as a Monday morning, invisible her whole life in the shadow of her sister's face, sat in the second pew and did the arithmetic her father was too frightened to do. The debts came due at Michaelmas. The articles were signed conditional on the marriage. There was no other offer, and there would be none. The scandal of this morning would see to that. Her father would be in the Fleet by Christmas. Renfold would go under the hammer. Her mother would be a poor relation in some cousin's cold house, and Isabel would be the beauty who had jilted a duke at the altar, which society would forgive in a year, because society forgave beauty everything. And Margaret, who had no beauty for anyone to forgive, would be nothing at all. She rose from the second pew. She walked up the aisle. She heard the whispering swell and did not care. And she stooped and picked her sister's veil up off the chapel floor and folded it over her arm as though it were washing to be got in before rain. Then, because her father still could not speak, she went to him and said, low and clear, "Papa, ask his grace if he will take me instead." Sir Charles stared at her as though one of the pews had spoken. "Margaret, the articles are drawn. The parson is paid. The county is watching," she said. "You have 2 daughters, and one of them is still in the church. Ask him." But it was the Duke who answered. He had turned. She had never in her life been so close to him, and she made herself look at his face steadily, the way you would look at any man's face, because she had decided in the second pew that she would begin as she meant to go on. The scar was a long one, and old. It ran along the left cheekbone and down toward the jaw, a pale seam in a face that would otherwise have been called severe and handsome, and his eyes, which were gray, rested on her with an expression she could not read at all. "You are not obliged, Miss Ashford," said the Duke of Ravenhall. His voice was low and rough, like a door on an unused hinge. "There is no debt of yours in those papers. There is my mother's roof in those papers, your grace," said Margaret. "And I am not in the habit of running out of churches. It creases one's gown." There was a silence. Then something moved in the gray eyes. She would spend the better part of a year learning what that particular movement was. And the Duke of Ravenhall inclined his head, as gravely as though she had been a queen, and not a plain girl in a second-best morning dress, holding her sister's thrown-away veil. "Then we shall want the solicitors," he said, "and 3 days. If you will do me the honor." That was the whole of the proposal. Afterward, when the county had been got out of the church and the story was already galloping down every lane in the shire, they met in the vestry, her father, her mother revived and weeping steadily, the Duke, and the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Harding, a dry, precise, grey-whiskered man who had ridden over with the articles in a dispatch box. And it was there, in the vestry, with her mother's sobs for music, that Margaret Ashford did the thing that everyone afterward agreed no bride in the history of the county had ever done, and which would, in the end, save a great deal more than her pride. She asked to read the marriage articles. Herself, all of them. "My dear Miss Ashford," said Mr. Harding, blinking, "the settlements are drawn most carefully, I do assure you. Your father's man of business is the man of business of a gentleman who owes £9,000, Mr. Harding," said Margaret, "and I am the person being married. I read tolerably well. I should like the articles, the schedule of debts, and a chair by the window, and I shall be as quick as I can." She was aware of her father going crimson, and of her mother's sobs stopping from pure astonishment, and of the Duke, behind her, making a sound that might have been a cough. Mr. Harding looked at his client. His client nodded, and Margaret sat down in the vestry window with 9 pages of law hand, and read them, line by line, while the church emptied and the candles were put out. And nobody in the room said a word. She found 2 things. The first she had expected, her sister's name, Isabel Mary Ashford, engrossed fair in every place where the bride was named. "This must be done again," she said. "My name is Margaret Ann. I will not sign as Isabel, and I will not have a marriage that a clever attorney can pick a hole in afterward. Draw it fresh, Mr. Harding, and where the name is changed, my father shall put his initials beside it in his own hand, so that no one may ever say the wrong sister was smuggled in unawares. He shall sign that he knows which daughter he is giving." Sir Charles spluttered. The Duke said, quietly, "It shall be done as Miss Ashford says," and it was done. The second thing she did not find, and its absence troubled her more than anything the pages contained. The articles cleared her father's debts, 9,000 and some odd hundreds of pounds, the figures marching down the schedule like a funeral procession, but nowhere did they say that the clearing was the end. "Mr. Harding," she said, "I have a question, and I want a lawyer's answer, not a comfortable one. If His Grace pays every figure in this schedule, what prevents my family from coming back? Next year, or in 5 years, when it is spent, what prevents them applying again, and again with the newspapers for a threat and me for a hostage?" Mr. Harding took off his spectacles and looked at her for rather a long time. "Nothing, madam," he said at last. "Nothing but their delicacy." "I have met their delicacy," said Margaret. "I want a clause. The payment to stand in full and final settlement of every claim of the family of Ashford, upon His Grace or upon me, present and future, of whatever kind, and my own settlement secured to my sole and separate use, so that no husband's creditor and no father's creditor can ever touch it. Can that be drawn?" "It can be drawn," said Mr. Harding, and put his spectacles back on, and looked at her over them, and if I may say so, Miss Ashford, in 30 years of this work I have known dukes who did not think to ask for it. Margaret. Her father burst out. This is unseemly, this distrust, before His Grace, my own daughter, treating her family like adversaries at law. You sold me before luncheon, Papa, said Margaret, without heat, folding the veil a little straighter on her arm. It is 3 o'clock. I am only writing down what we both already know. And Sir Charles Ashford, Baronet, of Renfold, looked away first, and initialed the margin the following day. Through the whole of it the Duke of Ravenhall stood by the vestry's cold hearth, and said almost nothing. But when the business was concluded, and her parents had gone out to the carriage, her mother now weeping on a new theory, that her daughter was saved, he stopped Margaret at the vestry door. You read the articles, he said. It was not a question. It sounded like a man reporting a marvel to himself. Someone in my family ought to, said Margaret. They call me the Beast, Miss Ashford, he said. You will have heard what is said of me, that I keep no company, that the house is half shut and the servants are strange, that what the war left of me is not fit to sit at table with. He said it without self-pity, flatly, the way a man reads out a bill of lading. You have 3 days. If you find you cannot, send 1 line to Harding, and the debts are cleared regardless. That is between us and no one else's business. Do you understand me? You are not obliged. Margaret looked at the scar, and at the gray eyes above it, and found that her heart was going like a mill race, and that it was not entirely fear. You are the second person today to tell me what I cannot do, Your Grace, she said. My sister has the county's sympathy already. She is welcome to it. I shall be at the church on Friday. I am told the veil is mine now. At any rate, it would be a pity to waste it. And for one moment, she was almost sure the ruined side of his mouth moved, the smallest fraction, as though it remembered how. They were married on the Friday, in the same church, before almost nobody, which suited Margaret, who had had enough of the county's eyes to last her the rest of her life. Her mother wept, her father studied his boots. Isabel did not come, having been sent to an aunt in Bath the same evening she ran, with the family's whole remaining credit spent on the post-chaise. Margaret wore her grey silk, the best gown she owned, and her sister's veil, washed by her own hands in the scullery at Renfold, because she would not ask the one remaining maid to do it, the torn hem mended by candlelight with stitches so small the tear might never have been. If she was to be married in a cast-off, it would at least be a cast-off in good repair. At the rail, while Mr. Price found his place, the Duke of Ravenhall bent his head. She felt, rather than heard, the words move the lace at her ear. It is not too late to run, he said. I will stand it better than you think. I have practice. I never run, Margaret said under the veil. I told you, it creases one's gown. And she put out her hand steadily before he could offer his, so that it was she who took his, and heard, above her head, the smallest catch in his breathing, and Mr. Price began. And in 11 minutes, which was no time at all in which to change the whole of a life, the plainest daughter of the most ruined baronet in the shire became Her Grace the Duchess of Ravenhall, married in a borrowed veil to the man the whole county called the Beast. When it came to the lifting of the veil, she did not wait for him. She had thought about it the night before, lying awake in her narrow bed at Renfold for the last time, how he would have to reach for it, not knowing what her face would do, whether she would manage her features or fail, whether he would find, at the very rail, one more woman flinching. So she lifted it herself, both hands back over her hair, and stood and looked up at him, quiet and bare-faced, waiting, and this time she watched the movement in the gray eyes, and began, just barely, to be able to read it. It looked like a man setting down something heavy that he had carried a long way. "Madam," said the Duke of Ravenhall, very low, "Your Grace," said Margaret, and she never could explain to herself afterward why. "I am given to understand you keep a good library." "Yes," he said. A pause. "It wants using." "Then we shall get on," said Margaret, and behind them, distinctly they heard old Mr. Price blow his nose with emotion, which spared either of them having to name what had just happened at the rail. Ravenhall Abbey stood a long day's travel to the north, at the end of an avenue of limes so old they met overhead, in a park where fallow deer lifted their heads to watch the carriage pass. Margaret had heard of the house all her life, the way children hear of houses in stories. "Half shut," they said, "the staterooms sheeted, the master in one wing and the servants creeping. No dinners these 6 years, no ball since the old Duke's time, no mirrors, that was the detail the county loved best, no mirrors anywhere in the living rooms, because his Grace could not endure what they had to tell him. She had it all from her mother's maid, who had it from a carrier, who had it from nobody at all, probably, and she sat in the swaying carriage with her hands folded on the borrowed veil, now laid up in silver paper in her smallest trunk, and watched the great grey house come up through the trees, and told her heart, as one tells a horse, to walk on. The Duke had ridden ahead. He rode everywhere. She would learn, in all weathers, as though stillness were the one enemy he had never beaten. And so it was the housekeeper who met her at the steps, a spare, upright woman of 60 with keys at her waist and a face that gave away nothing, who curtsied and said, "Your Grace." "I am Mrs. Bray. The house is glad of you," in a voice that made it impossible to tell whether the house was anything of the kind. "Thank you, Mrs. Bray," said Margaret. "I imagine the house has heard a great deal of nonsense about me already. I will save it the trouble of wondering. I am the plain sister. The articles are signed, and I have never run a house half this size in my life. I can learn anything I am shown, and I do not have tantrums. Shall we begin with where I am to sleep?" Something passed over the housekeeper's face. Later, much later, Mrs. Bray would tell her it was the moment the below-stairs betting on how long the new Duchess would stay was quietly abandoned, and she said, "This way, Your Grace," and led her up. The rooms they had given her were in the south front, and they stopped her on the threshold. Not because they were grand, though they were, but because they were warm. Fires burned in both grates, in June, against the evening chill of a stone house, and the bed was made up with a down quilt, and on the table by the window stood a jug of white roses cut that morning, and beside the roses, squared neatly to the table's edge, lay 3 books. Margaret crossed and read the spines. A volume of Cowper, a herbal, and the second volume of a novel, the very novel she had been reading at Renfold, left behind at the first volume's end because there had been no money for the subscription library that quarter. "Mrs. Bray," she said slowly, "who chose these?" "His Grace, madam," said Mrs. Bray in the doorway. "How did His Grace know I had got no further than the first volume?" "I'm sure I couldn't say, madam," said Mrs. Bray, whose face said that she could say perfectly well, and would not, and she curtsied and went out, leaving the new Duchess of Ravenhall standing alone in the warm room, holding the second volume, listening to her own heart, which had been told to walk on, breaking into something that was not quite a walk. She dined alone that first night, at one end of a mahogany table that could have seated 30, waited on in a silence so perfect she could hear the wine poured. His Grace, the butler informed her, a stooped, gentle old man named Granger, begged to be excused. His Grace kept early hours. She dined alone the second night as well. She was not offended. She had gathered enough, by then, to know it was not rudeness. It was the same thing the missing mirrors were, for her mother's maid had been right about the mirrors. There was not one to be found in any room the family used, only pale rectangles on the paneling where they had hung. The whole house was arranged around a man's certainty that he was unbearable to look at. He was sparing her, as he had tried to spare her in the vestry and at the rail. He would go on sparing her indefinitely, she saw. In this enormous silence, he had bought her family's safety and asked nothing at all. And he intended to go on asking nothing, at the far end of the house, for the rest of their 2 lives. Margaret bore it for 2 dinners. On the 3rd evening she walked the length of the table, took up her plate, her glass and her chair. The footman started forward, appalled. She stopped him with a look she had not known she possessed until she became a duchess, and she carried them down the room and set them at the other end, at the right hand of the great empty chair at the head. "Granger," she said, "you will lay my place here tonight and every night, if you please. And you will tell his grace, with my compliments, that the food is the same at both ends of the table, but the company at my end wants improving." Granger's chin trembled slightly. "Yes, your grace," he said, and there was something in the old man's voice like the sound of a door long stuck coming unstuck. The Duke came down the next evening. He came late and stiffly like a man walking into cold water, and he took the great chair with his scarred cheek turned away from her and said, "By way of good evening, you will find I am poor company, madam. It has been some years since I made any." "That is fortunate," said Margaret, "for I have spent 23 years being nobody's company at all. So neither of us is spoilt." She passed him the salt as though they had dined together 1,000 times. "I have been 3 days in your library, your grace. You have the whole of the poets, and not one of them cut past the 50th page. I intend to remedy it. Do you take an interest, or shall I simply report my findings at dinner?" There was a silence. The scarred side of his face was toward the candles now. He had turned, without noticing that he did it, to look at her properly. "Report your findings," said the Duke of Ravenhall. She reported her findings. That night, and the night after, and the night after that, and if anyone had told the county that the Beast of Ravenhall and the plain Ashford girl spent their first married month talking of Cowper and drainage, and the war in Spain, and the right management of a walled peach garden, an hour at table, sometimes 2, the servants moving soft as moths around a conversation nobody wished to end, the county would not have believed a word of it. He was not easy. He never became what the world calls easy. His sentences came out short and dry, like a man paying in exact change. He did not smile. When a dish required 2 hands, he wore the black glove even at table, and managed, with a terrible practiced neatness, one-handed. But he listened to her the way no one in her life had ever listened to her, with his whole still attention, as though her opinions on peach walls were dispatches from a front, and slowly, evening by evening, Margaret understood that what sat at the head of the table was not a monster, and had never been one. It was the shyest man she had ever met, wearing the county's most fearful face. The face itself she got used to so quickly it astonished her. That was the great secret nobody had told her about scars, she thought. They are loud for a week, and then they are only the face. Within a month, the scar had joined the weather of her days. Within 2, she could no longer clearly remember what the fuss in the church had been about. But she noticed that he never got used to it, that he still angled his ruined cheek from the light out of a habit so old it had worn grooves in every posture he owned, that he flinched, minutely, every time a servant new to the house looked at him a half-second too long. And one wet morning in the long gallery passage, she stopped in front of one of the pale rectangles on the paneling, and made a decision. "Mrs. Bray," she said, "where are the mirrors?" "In the north attics, madam, wrapped, leave them wrapped," said Margaret. "But I will have the small one from my dressing-case hung inside my book-room door, where none but I shall meet it. A woman likes to know her cap is straight." And Mrs. Bray, the housekeeper, turned back. "The fires. The library fire is lit each morning before I wake, and the small parlor after, and my rooms are never cold, and there are roses cut fresh twice a week, though I have never once ordered it. I have been keeping accounts. Who orders it?" For the second time something moved behind the housekeeper's stillness. "His Grace, madam," she said. "Every evening, before he retires. He asks what rooms you used in the day, and has them made warm for the morning. He has done it since the first night. We none of us are to speak of it." "Then we shall not speak of it," said Margaret steadily enough, and went into her warm book-room among her chosen books, and sat down at her table by the window, and looked for a long while at nothing. And that was the morning she stopped telling her heart to walk on, because it had stopped listening. It was July before she asked him about the scar, and she did not ask the question the world would have asked. They were at the chess table in the library. She had discovered he played, and played well, and that losing to her put him in a better humor than winning, because it meant she had not let him win, and the candle was between them, and for once he had forgotten to sit with his good side forward. She looked at the long pale seam along his cheekbone openly, because stolen glances were a coward's currency, and she had resolved never to pay him in it. "Does it pain you still?" said Margaret. "When the weather turns?" "My grandfather had an old wound from his sea days that told him of rain like an almanac." His hand stopped over the board. She watched him examine the question from every side, the way he examined everything, for the trap in it, for pity, which he would have hated, or disgust, which he expected, and find only what she had put there, which was a wife asking after her husband's comfort. "Yes," he said at last, "before rain." The cheek not much. The hand, he moved the black-gloved left hand slightly on the table's edge. The hand keeps a full calendar. "Then we shall keep the fires high when the glass falls," said Margaret, and took his bishop, "and you may tell me of the rain a day early, which is more than the almanac does for me. It is your move, your grace." 2 moves later, he said, without looking up, in the flat bill of lading voice she had learned, meant the opposite of indifference, Talavera. "A shell burst on the gun beside me. The surgeon was clever. I have kept the eye and most of the hand's use. There were men on that field who would have thanked God for my luck. I have tried to remember it." "And the men you commanded," said Margaret quietly, "did they run out of churches when they saw you after?" "No," he said, surprised into it. "Coles wept on my neck like a girl. He has never once—" He stopped. "No," said Margaret. "I imagine he has never once. Soldiers know what a scar is, I think. It is the mark of the day a man did not die. It is civilians who take it for the mark of a monster, because we are silly people who have never been shown the price of anything. Check, I am afraid, in 2. He was silent so long that she looked up from the board, and this time she could read the gray eyes without any difficulty at all, and had to look down again, and be very busy with a captured pawn. Sergeant Coles, the Duke's valet, Batman through the whole of Spain, a square brown block of a man who polished his master's boots as though the fate of armies still hung on it, began, about that time, to appear wherever the new Duchess happened to be, with small offerings of intelligence, delivered sidelong while apparently dusting something. Thus Margaret learned in installments what the county's version of her husband left out, that his grace had carried a wounded ensign 1.5 miles across that field before the shell came, and gone back, that the men of his battery had sent to the abbey, every year since, a letter at Christmas, every man's name signed, and that his grace answered every one in his own stiff left-taut hand, that the pension list of Ravenhall carried the names of 31 broken soldiers and 11 soldiers' widows, and had never once been spoken of above stairs. And thus she learned, at last, about Lady Sylvia Marchmont. Betrothed before Spain they were, said Coles, dusting a globe that did not want dusting, his back to her. The beauty of 2 seasons, and him the catch of 10. She wrote him letters to Lisbon. You could smell the scent off at the mess table, saving your grace's presence. Then came Talavera, and word of his face, and the letters stopped. While he was still under the surgeons, madam, that is when they stopped, and when we brought him home to the London house she came. Once I showed her up myself. He had asked the doctors that morning to take the bandages off before she came, because he said she should not have it sprung on her. She should see the worst first, and be free. And she looked at him the once, and she said, begging your grace's pardon, but I was at the door and I have never forgot it. She said, I was not bred to be a nurse. And she drew off his ring and set it on the table by the lancets, and was married to Lord Edgecombe within the 12-month. He never spoke her name from that day. But it was that day the mirrors came down. Madam, not Talavera, that day. Margaret sat very still by the library window, her book shut over her finger. 6 years of shuttered rooms, she thought. 6 years of dining alone and riding the park in the rain, and having the fires lit for a wife he never looked for. The shell had only ruined his cheek. It had taken an Englishwoman in a drawing-room, with a ring and one sentence, to teach him he was a monster. And her own sister at the altar rail had stood in that drawing-room's doorway and said the sentence over again to a man who had paid £9,000 for the privilege of hearing it twice. Thank you, Coles, she said at last. You may leave the Globe. It is quite clean. Yes, your grace, said Coles, and paused at the door, and said, not sidelong at all. The house is glad of you, madam. I say it that was at Talavera, gladder than it knows how to show. Her family meanwhile wrote. Her mother's letters came weekly, crossed and recrossed, and they had a pattern as fixed as wallpaper, 2 lines of tenderness, a page of the neighborhood, and then, sliding in sideways among the bonnets and the sermons, the money. The kitchen chimney at Renfold smoked so, £40 would mend it. Dear Papa's spirits were low. A stay at Harrogate was spoken of, if only. Isabel, here the hand always grew careful. Isabel was to be married, dearest, to Mr. Frederick Maule of the Albany, such an elegant man, though the settlements were nothing like, and a sister's generosity at such a moment. Margaret read each letter twice, answered the tenderness, ignored the sideways lines, and sent, each quarter day, out of her own pin money and by her own hand, a sum for her mother's private use, the same sum, regular as the moon, neither more nor less whatever the letters pleaded. She had drawn that boundary in the vestry at £9,000, and she did not move boundaries. It cost her something. It cost her less than the alternative, which she had watched swallow her father whole. Of Isabel's wedding the abbey took no notice, having received no invitation, the Beast at a Mayfair wedding breakfast being, the bride was heard to say, more than her nerves were equal to, though she hoped dear Margaret understood there was nothing meant by it. Margaret understood precisely what was meant by it. She sent the bride a silver teapot and her honest good wishes, and did not tell her husband what the bride was heard to say, though she suspected, from a certain dryness about him that week, that Coles's intelligence service worked in both directions. The county came to look at her, of course. It came in September, in the person of Lady Pargeter, the great gossip of the shire, a upholstered woman with clever little eyes who had talked of nothing but the church door scandal for a season and could no longer endure not seeing inside the house. She came with 2 daughters and stayed an hour and a quarter, and her eyes went everywhere, to the sheeted state-rooms glimpsed through doors, to the pale rectangles where the mirrors were not, to the Duchess's plain grey gown and the Duchess's plain steady face. So brave, said Lady Pargeter, over the second cup. That is what I say to everyone, my dear, a positive heroine. Of course we all understood the necessity, your poor papa. But I say to everyone, whatever the necessities, it takes courage to live so very retired. And with. That is, the little eyes glittered, hopeful. One hears his grace does not dine even at home? His grace dines with me every evening at 6, at the head of his own table, said Margaret pleasantly. We are dull, ancient, married people, Lady Pargeter, chess and the poets in early hours. I quite see it cannot be made interesting to the neighborhood, and I am sorry for it. A good scandal is a charity to a dull county, and we are no use at all. But surely, the seclusion, the poor state rooms all in Holland, we are opening them, said Margaret, hearing herself say it with some interest, for she had decided no such thing until that moment. By degrees. Rome was not aired in a day. More tea? When the Pargeter carriage had rolled away down the limes, she stood a while at the morning-room window, and became aware of her husband in the doorway behind her, boots and rein on him, come in from the park by the terrace door as he always did, in time to hear the last of it through the open window, as she suspected he knew perfectly well. "We are opening them," he repeated. "By degrees." "It seemed the quickest way to make her stop," said Margaret. "I am sorry. It was your house before it was my argument." "It is our house," said the Duke, and then, after a pause in which he looked at some point slightly to the left of her, "Which rooms would you begin with?" That was how the long gallery came to be unlocked. It was the one door in the house to which Mrs. Bray's ring held no key. Margaret had noticed it in her first week and asked nothing, the vestry having taught her that this man answered doors better than he answered questions. Now, that evening at the chess table, he laid a key beside the board. Old, heavy, cold from his pocket, where it must have ridden all afternoon. "The gallery," he said. "If the rooms are to be opened, it is first, or it will become a thing. There is a picture in it I would sooner you saw with me in the room. You will understand when you see it." She understood when she saw it. The gallery ran the whole north front, grey evening light on 100 years of Ravenhalls, and at its far end, past the periwigs and the horses, hung the last portrait, full length, 6 years dusty, a young colonel of artillery in scarlet and gold, dark, straight, laughing-eyed, one hand on a gun carriage, the handsomest man she had ever seen. And the man beside her, and no more like the man beside her than a bell before it is broken, is like a bell after. She looked at it a long time, aware of him rigid in the dusk at her shoulder. Waiting. She understood exactly what he was waiting for. He was waiting for her to mourn it. He had brought her here to get it over, the way he had had the bandages taken off for Lady Sylvia. See the worst. See what you did not get. Margaret looked her fill at the laughing colonel. Then she turned her back on him and looked up at her husband. "He is very fine," she said, "and I dare say he knew it, and I would not have got a word in edgewise at dinner. I prefer the one who listens. Shall we hang the gallery with new candles and walk it of an evening? It wants living people in it." The silence went on so long that she heard the rooks come home to the limes. When he spoke, his voice had sand in it. "They told you, I think," he said, "what she said. In London." "Everyone is told, eventually." "Yes," said Margaret. "I have wondered since June when you would get round to saying the opposite," he said. "It is what a kind woman would think she owed. I am asking you not to." Not that sentence turned inside out. I would always hear her voice under it. "Then I shall never say it," said Margaret. "I will say this instead. The fires, and the second volume, and my chair moved to the warm side of the hearth every evening for 11 weeks. You thought I had not noticed. I notice everything. It is the one talent of plain women. Nobody in my life has ever taken that kind of trouble over me, and I find her own voice betrayed her now, and she let it. I find I cannot hear her voice, or my sister's, or anyone's at all, under 11 weeks of lit fires. That is all. It is your move, your grace, and it has been your move for some time. And in the grey light of the gallery, under 100 years of his ancestors and 6 feet from the man he had stopped being, Adrian, Duke of Ravenhall, reached out his ruined left hand, the gloved one, the one he managed everything not to use, and touched, very carefully, as though it might not be allowed, a loose strand of her hair, and put it back behind her ear, and said, in a voice she had never heard him use, "Margaret," which was the first time in her whole life that anyone had said her name as though it were the point of the sentence and not the address on it. The great storm came at the end of October, off the moors, and it took an oak in the park and half the slates off the dairy, and the whole house into the one room with the best chimney, which was the library. The wind got into the flues and moaned like the house remembering things. The candles ducked, and Margaret and the Duke of Ravenhall sat late over the chess table neither of them was attending to. Because there are nights when weather unlocks houses, and both of them could feel it happening, and neither of them knew how to stop it, and one of them had stopped wanting to. It was she who began, though not on purpose. A gust struck the north front so hard that the boards of the old gallery overhead worked and creaked, and she said, to say something, "Your ancestors are restless tonight." "They have cause," he said, and then, abruptly, out of no conversation at all, in the voice of a man who has been rehearsing for a month and can no longer endure his own rehearsals, "Margaret, there is a thing you have a right to know, and I have not the courage to watch your face while you learn it, so I will tell it to the fire, and you may do with it what you please." She put her hands in her lap and was still. "You believe you were the substitute," he said to the fire. "The second choice. The plain sister thrown to the beast when the beauty ran. All the county believes it. Your family believes it. It is the shape of the whole story, and I have let you live inside that shape for 4 months, because the truth serves me so ill that telling it looked like begging. But it is 4 months of watching you make this house live, and I find I would rather be refused for what I am than loved in error for what I am not." So, he drew a breath like a man going under fire. 2 years ago, the winter before last, the public assembly at Millbrook, in the December, the subscription ball for the infirmary. You were there. "I was there," said Margaret slowly. "We went because it could not be got out of. The infirmary was Papa's one respectable subscription. I wore the blue that had been Isabel's." She stopped. "You were never at Millbrook. It was talked of for a 9 days' wonder, the Duke's card sent, and the Duke never." And then she did not finish that sentence either, because a memory came up out of the December dark with the completeness of a face rising in water. "I came," he said. "1 half-hour on the infirmary's account, because my father had founded the ward, and it was the last obligation I had not found a way to bury. I stood at the end of the long room by the door with my back to the pillar, and I watched a county full of people discover urgent business at the other end of it. 10 minutes was the debt. I stayed 10. And as I turned to go, a man near me, young Pargeter, I believe, who was drunk, stepped back from the dancing and struck my arm, and my glove fell, the left glove, which I had taken off because the hand was aching, and held in my hand like a fool rather than manage buttons before strangers. It fell in the lamplight, where every soul within 10 yards could see what it had been hiding. And every soul within 10 yards looked at the wall, or the ceiling, or the punch. The whole end of that room went blind in a body, from delicacy, which is the coldest thing a room can do to a man, except one young woman in a blue gown that did not fit her, who put down her cup and crossed the floor in front of everyone, and picked up my glove off the boards and gave it back into my ruined hand as though gloves fell all evening, and looked me in the face, not away from it and not at the scar, in the face, as you did in the vestry, and said, the rough voice stopped and steadied, "You will not remember what you said." "I said the floor was too crowded for dancing anyway," said Margaret, barely above the fire's noise, "and that if you were escaping I envied you, for I had 2 hours of it yet, and my shoes were borrowed and pinched." Her hands had closed on each other in her lap. "You said nothing at all. You bowed and went. Adrian, You were the Duke. I was nobody. It was 1 minute in a doorway 2 winters ago. I never told a living soul. There was nothing to tell. No, that is a lie. I may as well match you for honesty. I never told, because it was mine. The one time in my life a man had looked at me as though I were the thing in the room worth being surprised by. I kept it the way I kept my grandmother's ring, too small to wear and no one else's business. And I never knew it was you. She stopped herself on the edge of the cliff, and he turned from the fire at last to look at her. In the spring, he said, when I understood that I could not go on as I was, that the house was becoming a tomb with dinners, and harding at me every quarter about the succession like a man dunning a corpse for rent, I told him I would consider marriage on one condition, and I wrote the condition in my own hand, and it is in his strong box in Millbrook this night. I have sent for a copy. You may verify what I say, because you are you, and you read documents. Something that was almost his dry table humor surfaced through the wreck of his composure, and went under again. I wrote, the family at Renfold is embarrassed and has daughters. Harding was to open the matter with your father, the debts to be cleared entire in the articles. And at the foot, because I knew what your father was, and how such men hear such offers, I wrote, it is the younger daughter I mean, the one who reads. And your father, the Duke's voice went carefully, entirely flat. Your father wrote back to Harding that he was honored beyond expression, and that his beautiful Isabel was the jewel of the county, and would make me the envy of England. He had 2 daughters, and he heard a duke will pay £9,000 for one of them, and he priced his stock and sent the dearer article to market. And I, Margaret, here is the whole of my shame. Take it. I read that letter, and I let it stand. Because to write again, to insist, to say her name a second time, a man with his face, bargaining to have the particular young woman fetched, like a lord in an old wicked story, I could not endure how it would look to her when she learned of it. She would come bought and chosen, doubly trapped, and hate me doubly. Whereas the beauty came freely, or what your father swore was freely, and cared nothing either way, which I told myself was cleaner. It was not courage, it was the same cowardice that took down the mirrors, wearing better clothes. And so the wrong sister stood at my rail, and I deserved it, and I stood there while the church watched, thinking, this is exact, this is the bill for my cowardice presented promptly, and God is a scrupulous accountant. And then, and here the whole flat recitation broke down at last, and then the second pew stood up, and picked up the veil, and I heard your voice say, ask him if he will take me instead, and Margaret, I knew your voice before I ever turned. I have known it 2 years. At the rail on the Friday, under the veil, when I said it was not too late to run, it was not nobility, it was terror. I thought, she does not know she is the one I asked for. She thinks she is the sacrifice. And if she ever learns the truth in some cold legal way, from Harding, from a document, she will believe I arranged it all, ran the beauty off somehow, angled for her like a I do not know what I thought. The storm is the first courage I have had. That is the whole of it. You were never the substitute. You were the letter. Your father sold you to a man who had already, he stopped and finished with great care, in a voice stripped of everything, who had already chosen you, and was too much a coward to say so twice. The wind worked at the house. The fire folded and settled. Margaret Ashford, Margaret Ravenhall, sat with her hands in her lap, and found that she was not shaking. That in fact she had never in her life felt so still, as though some lifelong low vibration she had believed was simply what living felt like had been switched off at the wall. Show me, she said at last, gently. No, I take it back. I do not need the copy from Harding's strong box. She rose and crossed to his chair through the ducking candlelight and stood before him and held out her hand. I am not going to say what you are afraid I will say, nor its opposite. I am going to observe, as the person in this house who reads the documents, that you have just confessed to me that I was married under a misapprehension in a matter material to the contract. She watched the gray eyes fly up to hers, appalled. She kept her face grave and her hand steady. The remedy, she said, is to execute it again. Not the church, the rail is Mr. Price's, and we did that part properly. I mean the other signature. You never once danced with me, Adrian, not at Millbrook. The floor was too crowded. We agreed. Not at our wedding, there was no breakfast, my mother wept through what there was, and you would not have asked. There is a ballroom under Holland covers 40 feet from this door, and a storm to drown the fiddles we have not got, and I am given to understand you were, before Talavera, accounted the best dancer of 10 seasons. The articles are silent on the point. I am claiming it now. Margaret, he said, not moving, his hand an inch from hers. The hand is not. I have not, since no one has. And every sentence broke off at the place where the glove began. Then we are evenly matched, said Margaret, for no one has ever danced with me twice, and we shall be bad at it together, in the dark, where your ancestors cannot see us, and mine had better not. Take off the glove, my dear, it is only me. And in the sheeted ballroom of Ravenhall Abbey, by the light of one candle set on the floor, with the storm doing duty for an orchestra, and the furniture standing about in its dust covers, like the ghosts of chaperones, the Duke of Ravenhall drew off, finger by finger, the black glove his own house had not seen the inside of in 6 years, and his wife took the ruined hand in both of hers, bare, and set it at her waist, and they danced, badly as promised, laughing before the end, which neither of them had done in so long that the sound astonished them both in the dark like a third person, and the county that would have paid any money to see it never saw it and never knew. Which is why the county's version of this story has always been wrong at the center, like most of the county's versions of most things. She was ill in February. It began as the winter colds of that hard year began everywhere in the shire, and then it went to her chest, and for 9 days it was not a cold, but a fear that stood in the corners of the room. The physician came from York and stayed, and the fires were kept so high the grates roared, and afterwards the household would tell it always in the same words, that his grace did not leave the door. Meals went up and came down. Harding came from Millbrook on estate business and was sent away unmet. The Duke sat in the dressing-room with the door ajar, listening to her breathe. The whole of every night, Mrs. Bray found him there at dawn on the worst morning, upright and gray as the window, and did not dare speak to him, and when the fever turned at last, on the 10th evening, and Margaret woke weak and clear-headed with the candle low, she found the great chair drawn up to her bedside, and her husband asleep in it for the first time in 10 days, and his left hand, bare, careless, unhidden, the glove fallen somewhere and forgotten days ago, wrapped around her hand on the counterpane, holding on in his sleep. She did not wake him. She lay in the low light and looked at the ruined hand holding hers, the old shine of the burn, the stiff, crooked fingers that managed everything so proudly, one-handed, and had held nothing, been offered nothing, 6 years, and at the scarred face slack and undefended in the chair, unbearable to no one in that room. And Margaret, who did not cry, cried quietly, so as not to wake him. And then she slept again, holding on, and got well. The letter from Renfold came in April, and it was not in her mother's hand. It was in her father's, which Margaret had last seen initialing a margin in a vestry, and it was a masterpiece of its kind. 3 pages of injured affection, closing on the intelligence that Sir Charles would do himself the honor of waiting upon his dear daughter and his grace on the Thursday fortnight, accompanied by his man of business, Mr. Tolly. There being matters arising from the late settlements which it would be in everyone's interest, the word everyone's was underlined, to arrange privately, as a family, rather than otherwise. Margaret read it twice, at the breakfast table, and passed it to her husband without comment. He read it once. Rather than otherwise, he repeated. Your father has learned to write like a man leaving a horse's head in a bed. What has happened, do you suppose? Maul has happened, said Margaret. Isabel's husband. Mamma's letters have been losing their bonnets and keeping their chimneys all winter, the Albany given up in January, the pear sold in February, and last month she wrote that Isabel was stopping at Renfold while Mr. Molly arranges his affairs, which in my mother's language is a fire-bell. Papa mortgaged his peace to a spendthrift son-in-law within 18 months of a duke paying his debts to the last shilling. The £9,000 is gone, Adrian, gone through the same hole the first 9,000 went through, because we settled the debts and could not settle the man. And now they are coming here, with an attorney, to open the mine they think they left under this house. The substitution, said the Duke. The substitution, said Margaret. It is the only card in their hand. The articles were negotiated for Isabel. Isabel never signed. The exchange was made in a day, in a vestry, in a scandal. Mr. Tolly will have told Papa there is matter there, fraud on the contract, misrepresentation, a settlement voidable if anyone were vulgar enough to bring it before the King's bench, or better, before the newspapers. They do not want a lawsuit. They could not fund one. They want to be bought off, quietly, as a family, rather than otherwise. She folded the letter along its creases. Very exactly. He is coming to sell me a second time, this time back. Her husband's face, as she said it, was the face the county had told stories about, and for once the stories would not have been far wrong. And he said, in a voice with the gun deck in it, You will not sit in a room while it is done. I will meet them with Harding, and it will be brief. No, said Margaret, and she said it so quietly that he stopped. My dear, no, hear me. For 9 months you have put yourself between me and every cold drought in England, and I will love you the whole of my life for it. It was the first time the word had ever crossed the table in daylight. And she watched it land, and gave it no ceremony, because ceremony would have frightened them both. But this is not your fight to spare me. It is the fight I was born in. They have believed all my life that I would always, in the end, hold still and be spent, that I was the daughter you could take things from, the quiet one, the plain one, the one whose whole vocation was to cost nothing and yield when pressed. If you buy them off, or you frighten them off, they will only come back when we are older. Worse, they will be right about me forever. No, write to Mr. Harding, ask him to attend on the Thursday, and ask him to bring the deed box, all of it. And then, my love, I want you in the room and silent, which will be hard for you, and you will see what your cowardly letter bought you 2 winters ago. It bought the daughter who reads. Sir Charles Ashford arrived on the Thursday fortnight in a hired chaise, wearing his best coat and his old assurance, with Mr. Tolly beside him, a narrow, smiling attorney with a portfolio under his arm, and, which Margaret had not foreseen, and her father plainly considered a masterstroke, Isabel in lilac, more beautiful than ever, and a little sharpened, the way gilt sharpens when the plate wears, Isabel, deployed as a reproach, and an exhibit, set her presence on the steps, the true bride, the wronged original, the woman whose place was taken. Margaret received all 3 in the library with unimpeachable tea, and watched her sister's eyes go round the room pricing it, and waited. Mr. Tolly opened proceedings with a quarter hour of smiling regret. Painful family circumstances, the reverses suffered by Sir Charles through no want of prudence. Margaret drank her tea. The peculiar and, he must say, irregular history of the Ravenhall settlements, the substitution of one party for another after negotiation, and without fresh consideration, the very real questions. He said it caressingly, like a man stroking a dog he means to set on you. The very real questions any court must entertain as to whether the articles as executed could stand. The distress of public examination of such questions must cause to a lady now so happily, if he might say so irregularly established, and the earnest desire of his client to compose the whole matter within the family, upon terms which, given the resources of the parties, would be felt by nobody. "Name the terms, Mr. Tolly," said Margaret pleasantly. "You have been 40 minutes not naming them, and the tea is going cold." Mr. Tolly smiled and named them: an annuity to Sir Charles of 800 a year, secured on the estate; the discharge of Mr. Frederick Maule's more pressing obligations, a schedule could be furnished; and a suitable provision for Mrs. Maule. He bowed toward the lilac, the intended beneficiary of the original settlement, whose sacrifice of position had never been recognized. "Whose sacrifice?" said Margaret. "I see. Yes, thank you, Miss Tolly. That is admirably clear. Now I shall be equally clear, and then Mr. Harding, whom you know, will show you 3 papers, and then there will be an end." She set down her cup. She did not raise her voice. She had never in the whole of this story raised her voice, and she did not intend to begin for Mr. Tolly. "Your case, as I understand it, is that the wrong sister was married, that the articles contemplated Isabel, and Margaret was slipped in by sleight of hand, and the whole edifice therefore trembles. Mr. Harding, the first paper, if you please." Harding, dry as a law-calf binding, drew it from the deed-box and laid it on the table, turned to face the visitors. "The marriage articles," he said, "as executed. The court will look in vain for the name of Isabel Ashford." The instrument was re-engrossed entire. 2 days before the marriage, at the express requirement of the bride, Margaret Ann Ashford, so named at every point where the bride is named, 14 times. And here, his dry finger came down, and here, and at each place where the name was altered from the earlier draft, the court will find the initials C.A. in the hand of Sir Charles Ashford, subscribing each alteration, and at the foot, above his full signature as party, a sentence I had not, in 30 years of practice, been asked to draw before that week. And the said Sir Charles Ashford acknowledges that he gives in marriage his daughter Margaret Ann, and no other, with his full knowledge and consent. The bride required it, Sir Charles, if you recall, in the vestry. In these words, he shall sign that he knows which daughter he is giving. You laughed, I believe, and called it maidenly nerves, and signed. There is no question of substitution known to the law of England that survives that page. The library was very quiet. Isabel had stopped pricing the room. Sir Charles's assurance was performing the maneuver his daughter knew of old, becoming injury. Mr. Tolly reached for the articles, read the foot of the page, and did not smile. "The second paper," said Margaret. "The receipt and release," said Harding, laying it beside the first, executed by Sir Charles Ashford upon the discharge of the scheduled debts. "I direct your attention, Mr. Tolly, to the second clause, the discharge to stand in full and final settlement of every claim of the family of Ashford, or any member or connection thereof, upon his grace or upon the said Margaret Ann, whether present or future, of whatsoever kind. Your client executed it before 2 witnesses. Your entire errand this afternoon, sir, is an attempt to present a claim. I am instructed to inform you that the clause was not of his Grace's drawing, nor of mine. The bride required that also. She was 23, and she asked me, in a vestry, with her wedding 2 days off, what would prevent her family coming back when the money was spent. I told her, nothing but their delicacy. she said, and here even Harding's dryness admitted, for one syllable, something that was almost warmth. She said, "I have met their delicacy. I want a clause." Mr. Tolly read the clause twice. Then he began, quietly, to buckle his portfolio, which is the sound an attorney makes instead of striking his colors. "Papa," said Margaret. Sir Charles Ashford looked at his younger daughter, really looked, perhaps for the first time in the whole cold history of that family, and what he saw at the head of the library table looked steadily back at him and was not for sale, had never. He dimly began to understand. Been for sale, the transaction in the vestry having been, though he had held the pen believing otherwise. Not his sale of her, but her purchase of him, £9,000 to be rid, cleanly, forever, on paper, of the family that priced its daughters. "You would see your own father reduced," he managed. "Your sister, your mother. My mother's allowance is paid quarterly into her own hand and no one else's, and will be while I live," said Margaret. "It is the same to the shilling next quarter as last, and it will not become 800 a year secured on my husband's land, because money that touches your hands, Papa, or Mr. Molla's, is water poured on sand, and I have watched it these 10 years, and I am done watering sand." Isabel, she turned to the lilac, and her voice, which had been all steel filings, altered, not softening exactly, becoming exact. "You may tell me yourself. Were you willing to come here today and swear before a court if wanted that you were wronged of your place? In this house? His house?" Isabel Mowley née Ashford, the beauty of the shire, looked at the window, and the carpet, and her gloves, and then, for one unguarded instant, at the tall figure standing silent by the chimney-piece with his scarred cheek full in the spring light, watching his wife with an expression that no one had worn in 26 years while looking at anything belonging to Isabel. And Margaret watched her sister take, at last, the full inventory, the room, the man, the marriage, the mistake, and understand what she had thrown down on a chapel floor. "No," said Isabel, barely audibly, to her gloves. "I was not wronged. I refused him." And then, with a flash of the old spirit, bitter and honest at once, "The only honest thing she said that day, you always did pick up whatever I threw away, Meg. I used to think it was because you had to." Her eyes came up once more, went from her sister to the Duke and back, and something in her face finished falling. "It was never because you had to." "No," said Margaret gently. "It was never because I had to. They were gone within the hour." At the steps, while Tolly climbed into the chaise and Isabel stood veiled and silent, Sir Charles turned for a last throw. Habit, mostly, the gambler's fingers moving after the game is lost. "The world shall hear," he said, "how the Duchess of Ravenhall turned her own blood from her door." And it was then that the Duke of Ravenhall spoke, for the first time in that whole long afternoon, from the doorway of his house, in the low, rough, carrying voice that had once steadied gun crews in the smoke. "You sold her, sir," he said. "She was the only thing in your possession you never once valued, and you sold her to a man you believed to be a monster, sight unseen, to cover your play. The world may hear whatever you can afford to tell it. But you will get down the steps of this house now, and you will not come up them again. A man may buy his way out of many things, but not out of having held that pen. Good day." The chaise rolled. The limes took it, and the lodge and the road, and Margaret stood on the steps of Ravenhall in the April light, and felt her husband come to stand at her shoulder, and discovered that what she felt watching her family go was not triumph, and not grief, but the sensation of a long sum finally proved and ruled off, and under it, rising, quiet and enormous, the rest of her life. "You were silent," she said, as instructed. "It was very hard for you, I think. It was the hardest hour since Talavera," said the Duke gravely, "and I would not have missed it for the guns of both armies. I have met their delicacy. I want a clause." He shook his head slowly. "2 years ago I wrote to Harding, the younger one, the one who reads. Margaret, I did not know the half of what I was asking for." "No," said Margaret, and put her hand through his arm. "The left, always the left. That was law now at Ravenhall. You asked for a reader. And you got an attorney. Come in out of the wind, my dear. We are opening the ballroom in May, and I want your opinion of the chandeliers. You are tall, and it saves the ladders." The Ravenhall ball was given on the last Thursday in May, the first in 11 years, and the county came. The county would have crawled there on its hands and knees over gravel, curiosity having reached by then the pitch of a kettle left on since June of the year before. They came prepared to pity, which is what the county wore that season. They had their sentences ready, the poor brave creature sentences, the how well she bears it sentences. And they got out of their carriages under a blaze of windows, every holland cover gone, every chandelier lit. Lady Pargeter counted, her lips moving, and gave it out on oath afterward, 140 wax candles in the ballroom alone. And they were received at the head of the stairs by the Duke and Duchess of Ravenhall, standing side by side. And the Duchess wore grey silk and no jewels but a wedding ring, and the Duke wore no glove, and the sentences died in the county's throat, all together, like the candles of a snuffed chandelier, because you cannot pity a man whose wife is looking at him like that. The county discovered it in the first minute, standing on the stairs with its mouths arranged for condolence. It is a simple discovery, and it rearranges everything, like the first sight of the sea. The scar was there. The whole shire had rehearsed the scar for 6 years, and the shire stood in the receiving line and found the scar had somehow become the least interesting fact in the room, become what it had been all along. If a single soul had troubled to look, the mark of the day, a man did not die. What was interesting was the way the Beast of Ravenhall bent his head to hear what his plain wife murmured behind her fan, and what the county saw across his ruined face when he heard it, which was not gratitude, whatever the drawing-rooms decided later, and not the pathetic devotion of the rescued, but the private, unmistakable, faintly smug amusement of a man who is married to the person he finds most interesting in England, and knows it, and knows the room is only now catching up. They opened the dancing together. He danced correctly and a little sternly, the left hand bare at her waist. The whole floor pretended not to watch and watched, and midway down the set he said, under the violins, "They are all looking at my hand," and Margaret said, placidly, turning under his arm, "Nonsense, my dear. They are looking at mine, and counting the rings, and finding one. It is the greatest disappointment the county has suffered since your gates were shut. They had me in diamonds and you in chains, and here we are, only married. Lady Pargeter may never recover. Do attend to the figure. You are the best dancer of 10 seasons, and I have a reputation to maintain." And the Duke of Ravenhall laughed, aloud, on his own ballroom floor in front of the assembled shire for the first time in 11 years. And that, not the candles, was the intelligence that traveled 3 parishes by Sunday. Lady Sylvia, Countess of Edgecombe, was announced at 11. She had angled for the card through a cousin of a cousin, and she came up the stairs beautiful and brittle as sponge sugar, trailing a husband with a face like unpaid bills, and Margaret, watching her advance, felt her own spine arrange itself, and heard, very low at her shoulder, her husband's voice, perfectly steady. I had wondered which courage this would take. It appears it takes none at all. Well, better late than never. And when the Countess reached the head of the stairs and swept her curtsy, and lifted glittering eyes prepared for anything, for coldness, for a scene, for the exquisite spitefulness the great can serve at their own stairheads, the Duke of Ravenhall bowed over her hand with flawless, bottomless, weightless correctness, and said, "Lady Edgecombe." "You are very welcome. May I present the Duchess?" and turned to his wife with his whole scarred face open and easy in the candlelight. And that was all, and the Countess of Edgecombe understood, in the time it takes to rise from a curtsy, that she had been, these 6 years, not mourned, not hated, not remembered, recovered from, that she now ranked, at Ravenhall, somewhere between the weather and the wallpaper. And she went down the whole glittering length of a ballroom that had once been promised her, on her husband's arm, with her face beautifully composed, and was never heard by any servant of that house to mention the family again. "I was not bred to be a nurse," she had said once, over a ring and a table of lancets. It was the Duchess of Ravenhall's private opinion, confided many years later to Mrs. Bray over the linen book, that the sentence had proved a truer prophecy than the lady ever knew, for she had not been bred to be anything at all that wears, and the proof of a woman's breeding, like the proof of a stone's, is what it does under years. The years came, and did what years do to happiness that has been built on rock, made it larger and quieter, and more amused. The state-rooms opened, one by degrees, as promised. Rome not aired in a day, until the house was simply a great house again, and young pargeters and their cousins danced at Christmas, where the holland covers had been. The mirrors came down from the north attics, unwrapped one winter, at the Duke's own word, and went back on the paneling. The county said the Duchess had ordered it, and the county, as usual, was wrong. She had only lived in the house until the man in it could pass his own reflection with his mind on other matters, which is all any of us can say of ourselves, and more than most. His portrait was painted the year after, as he was, scar and grey and the bare left hand resting on his wife's chair, and hung in the long gallery at the end of the line, beside the laughing colonel, and Margaret would stop before the pair of them sometimes, on her evening walk down the gallery, and consider them both with her head a little tilted, and once, caught at it, she said only, "I keep the first for reference, to remind me what I was spared." He would have talked through dinner. The veil never left the house. It lay, washed and pressed and folded in silver paper, in the cedar chest in her dressing-room, where it had gone the week she came, and beside it, from the February of her illness onward, lay the black glove, retired, its work done, and on an evening every June. The servants knew, and contrived to be elsewhere. The chest was opened, and the two of them looked a while, together, at the whole story folded up in cedar, the thrown-down thing and the hidden thing, the lace her sister could not bear to wear, and the leather he could not bear to be seen without, keeping company in the dark like the pair of foolish sentences they had both outlived. She had picked one of them up off a chapel floor. She had drawn the other off, finger by finger, in a sheeted ballroom in a storm. It was Coles who said it first, below stairs, and Mrs. Bray who repeated it until it became the private catechism of that whole household, that the county had sent her Grace to Ravenhall, expecting a beast. And the only monster in the story had worn a baronet's coat and held the pen himself. She had married the rumour and found the man. They were married 31 years. He told her of the rain a day early, all his life, and was never once wrong. She kept the fires high when the glass fell, and read the documents, and there was not a tenant on that land, nor a broken soldier on that long, quiet pension list, nor a servant in that house, who did not hold what the county at last came round to holding, the county coming round, as usual, some 30 years after its housekeepers, that the plain sister had made the great marriage of her generation, that the girl nobody looked at had been all along the one worth looking for, and that of the two brides who stood at that altar rail in the June of the year 9, the one who ran had refused a face, and the one who stayed had accepted a man, sight unseen, on the strength of lit fires and a second volume, and had been right. Quiet women usually are. It is the one advantage of a life spent watching. Her sister had thrown down a veil and kept her fear. Margaret had picked the veil up off the cold stones of the chapel floor, and worn it, mended, past every warning the world could shout, and it had carried her. As such borrowed, despised, thrown away, things will sometimes carry the one soul, with the courage to stoop for them, into the only house in England where someone had already chosen her. She had married the rumor, and found the man. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.